saying that. On behalf of the Harvard Museum of Art, one of the sponsors and this year's host of the second annual D.H. Lawrence Lecture, I want to welcome the UNM alumni to Towson, to Harvard. And I want to welcome Dr. Andrew Harrison, Associate Professor of English Literature and Director of the D.H. Lawrence Research Center at the University of Nottingham, who will read from his critical biography of Lawrence. I can't tell you how delighted I am that Harvard is hosting this lecture. Well, of course I can. I have a podium and I have a microphone. It's a figure of speech. But what I mean is this. Actually, we are not a captive audience. We all chose to be here. And I would submit that we chose to be here because we subscribe to a principle that was laid down by Northrop Frye in his magisterial work, Anatomy of Criticism, published in 1947. Frye described his work as a book of 4 essays attempting a synoptic view of the scope, theory, principles, and techniques of literary criticism. By literary criticism, he meant the whole work of scholarship and taste concerned with literature, which is part of what is variously called liberal education, culture, or the study of the humanities. And the critical premise that Frye started from is, and I quote, the principle that criticism is not simply a part of this larger activity, but an essential part of it. I'm here, and I would submit that we're here because we embrace that principle. We hold that criticism is essential to our engagement with all the arts. For Frye, criticism in practice involves an examination of literature in terms of a conceptual framework derived from an in-depth survey of the literary field. I believe that the practice of criticism, the harnessing of our critical faculty, keeps in check our response to works whose merits are measured by popularity alone, box office, based on the failed but persisting romantic theory that public taste is natural and therefore criticism is artificial. And likewise, the critical practice gives the lie to the equally vacuous notion that art or literature or music is elitist, involving some initiation into what Frye called an esoteric civilized community. Frye was among the first to establish principles about criticism that are now widely accepted. Far from being a parasitic form of creative expression, criticism grows out of the art it deals with. The first thing the literary critic has to do is to read literature in depth and let his or her critical principles shape themselves out of his knowledge of that field. And the critic is essential to our appreciation of literature, precisely because that is not the aim of an author or poet or artist. Frye refers to a most important sense in which poems are as silent as statues. Poetry is a disinterested use of words. It does not address a reader directly. In other words, it doesn't try to say something. That would be to confuse the expressive, intuitive function of the artist, the author, the poet, with the interpretive role of the critic, and to confuse literature with writing that is primarily concerned to say something. In his iconic television documentary series, Civilization, the British art historian Kenneth Clark observed that if I had to say which was telling the truth about society, a speech by the Minister of Housing or the buildings put up in his time, I should believe the buildings. When Frye notes that it is generally accepted that a critic is a better judge of the value of a poem than its creator, he concludes that an axiom of criticism must be not that the poet does not know what he or she is talking about, but that the poet cannot talk about what he or she knows. And if they do, they are just another, often indifferent, critic of their own work. The poet cannot talk about what he or she knows, but the critic can. That's why a work like Dr. Harrison's critical biography of Lawrence is essential to an informed reading of Lawrence himself. It leads us past anecdote to the realm of insight. It lets us hear what the work itself is not trying to say. That's why in the museum we want trained docents, each an informed art critic. That's why we have criticism, why we can't do without it. A public that tries to do without criticism, wrote Fry, and asserts that it knows what it wants or likes, brutalizes the arts and loses its cultural memory. The only way to forestall the work of criticism is through censorship, which has the same relation to criticism that lynching has to justice. One final, more personal observation, one that addresses what is, for me, perhaps the most important contribution that criticism makes to liberal education, the study of the humanities, the cultivation of the arts. As we come to see that criticism is not simply a part, but an essential part of the pursuit of arts and culture, we soon realize that the pursuit of arts and culture itself is an existential part of life. So again, welcome to you all, and welcome Dr. Harrison. It's my pleasure now to yield the podium to Dr. Sarah Kotchian. Dr. Kotchian, who received her PhD in American Studies in 2000, is a board member of the Alumni Association and member of the UNM Lobo Living Room Committee. Her recent book of poetry, entitled Camino, traces her solo 500-mile pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago, the medieval network of pilgrim routes to the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. Please welcome Dr. Kotchian.
Good morning, and I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of the UNM Alumni Association, the D.H. Lawrence Branch Initiatives, the Department of English Language and Literature, and of course the Harwood Museum of Art. What a beautiful place this is. Thank you for that introduction to our speaker and the importance of his critical work. I'm first going to ask Harold Lavender to come up. Harold is the president of the UNM Alumni Association, and he and his wife Judith are both alums of the University of New Mexico. Judith, in her own right, is a specialist in early childhood education and passionate about national standards and active locally in making sure that we raise those standards and we pay attention to what happens to our children in their early years. And Harold majored in American literature, in English, minored in American literature, got his law degree here, went away to Chicago on the Futures Exchange for 34 years, and came back to the place he loves and has thrown himself into work on behalf of this university. He's the president of our association. He's an adjunct professor at the Anderson School. So I'd like to welcome Harold.
How wonderful is it to see this many people come out on a Saturday morning to hear something that some would consider to be esoteric, but those of us who really know it know that it's real life. So it's really neat to have you all here and to be able to welcome you. I have the enviable task, and I think that what's been really fun for me is I get to go to lots of things like this in this role, and boy, is that cool. I mean, you know, it's like you, as a matter of fact, I've even been encouraged to go to some things that I might not have normally gone to, simply because I do lead a busy life, but getting to do these kinds of things is really wonderful. My job this morning is to introduce some folks who are with us today and to make sure you're aware of the people who made this particular event come together. Sharon Ord Warner, who is the director of the D.H. Lawrence Initiatives, and would you stand up and let the crowd recognize you? Ava Lipton-Ormond, who is the program director for the D.H. Lawrence Initiatives, and she's over here on the side. We've got Kim Feldman, Dr. Kim Feldman, I'll say, the associate director of the UNM Alumni Relations Office. Dean Richard Clement, who is the dean of the library of the University of New Mexico, and my my one admission that I have to admit is that I didn't spend as much time in the library as I probably should have, but my wife was part of an organization which required her to be in the library several hours each evening, and that's when I was in the library at the same time. So that'll tell you about that. Anyway, I like that. That's a fun thing. This wouldn't be possible without the collaboration of a number of terrific organizations and people. I want to just run down that list, and it's on the back of your program. I normally don't like to read that, but I'm going to give it to you really quickly. The D.H. Lawrence Ranch Initiatives, the Department of English, Language, and Literature at the University of New Mexico, the UNM Alumni Association, the UNM Harwood Museum of Art, UNM Student Affairs, UNM Honors College, UNM American Studies, UNM Foreign Languages and Literatures, and UNM International Studies Institute. Again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the fact that each of you are here. Welcome. And I'm going to turn the program now back over to Sarah to introduce our speaker.
Well, you're in for a treat. We've gotten to spend some time with Andrew Harrison over the last day, and his passion and his excitement and his just plain joy in being in this country of D.H. Lawrence and Taos, and knowing what he knows, much more than any of us know about Mabel Dodge Lujan and all of those relationships. It's just, he just lights up when he talks about it. He's this Associate Professor of English at the University of Nottingham, UK. And he's received awards for excellence in his teaching, and he talks about his students, and I think they're so lucky. He's also director of the D.H. Lawrence Research Center in the School of English there. He's president of the D.H. Lawrence Society of Great Britain, and he's a member of the D.H. Lawrence Society of North America. Since 2006, he has discovered a number of new D.H. Lawrence letters and unpublished works and edited and published them to make them available. He's also worked with local and international media to raise the profile of D.H. Lawrence in the world, and especially beyond the academic community. He's author of D.H. Lawrence and Italian Futurism, A Study of Influence, The Life of D.H. Lawrence, A Critical Biography, co-editor of D.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers, a casebook, published a number of essays on Lawrence and his contemporaries, including Virginia Woolf. I think we should invite him back every year and tell us about another one of his contemporaries. And now a new major collection that's coming out entitled D.H. Lawrence in Context. He's speaking today on the first D.H. Lawrence biography he wrote, The Life of D.H. Lawrence, A Critical Biography. And he's also, we'll talk about some recently uncovered works and some unpublished photographs. So just a real treat for all of us to help welcome Dr. Andrew Harrison.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much to the Harwood Museum for inviting me to come to talk about and read from the recent critical biography I wrote about and published about D.H. Lawrence. Thank you also to everybody for turning up. I can't believe the amount of support that the talks that I've given have received, both in Albuquerque and in Taos. It's really heartening for me to see the amount of interest in D.H. Lawrence, and also the amount of passion that people put into celebrating Lawrence's legacy and his place here in New Mexico. That's really wonderful. I am director of the D.H. Lawrence Research Center at the University of Nottingham, lecture there in 20th century literature. I also live in Eastwood, actually, Lawrence's birthplace in Nottinghamshire. I've lived there, bought a house there about 4 years ago. So coming to Taos, actually for the second time, the last time was a fleeting visit. This time I'm getting to see a little bit more of the place. It's just reminded me how far Lawrence travelled in every way, both physically, intellectually and emotionally during his life. I think his remarkable courage to strike out on his own, of course against the censors, against those who called him obscene or called his mind a sewer, to discover modes of living that were radically different from those that he knew as a young boy and a young man in Eastwood and as a teacher in Croydon, are quite extraordinary. He lived, of course, for 2 spells in New Mexico. Between 1922 and 1923, and then 1924 and 1925, he had a brief European interlude in that time, not a terribly happy one, returning to the grey, kind of grim winter of London in 1923 to 24. And of course he said that New Mexico was the greatest experience that he'd ever had from the outside world. For me, for anybody who's been to Eastwood and who comes back to Taos, you can actually see, I mean, it's just extraordinary the amount of ground that he covered in his life. It's quite extraordinary, I think. Well, what I propose to do, actually, is to intersperse a few readings from my biography with what I hope are some fairly lively anecdotes about the more interesting research findings that informed it. In the process of these readings, I'll be describing some of his very, very different experiences in Eastwood and in New Mexico, specifically, of course, in Taos. I should say that this was the first biography I ever wrote. It's a very intimidating thing to do, to write a biography of D.H. Lawrence, because I can't think of any other major modern writer who's been so well served by criticism, and particularly by scholarship. Critical biographies of Lawrence, scholarly biographies, have been appearing since the 1950s, and the Cambridge biography of Lawrence, written by John Worthen, Mark Kincaid Weeks and David Ellis, is just monumental. And I should, I think, say before I start and talk about my own research, that John Worthen gave me a huge amount of support in writing the biography. He read a draft of it, helped me to shape it into its final form. It's one of the great joys of working on Lawrence, that there are so many people prepared to share their knowledge and experience to help you know, improve the account that you give of the life. That said, I do fortunately think that I've managed just in a few marginal areas to add something to the biographical record, and I'll describe how those kind of insights came about in the course of what I'm about to say. So I'm going to start with a reading that has to be, I think, from the very beginning, from the birth and from the early life in Eastwood. So this is really from the very start of the biography, and it describes Lawrence's early life in Eastwood in Nottinghamshire. D.H. Lawrence was born on Friday the 11th of September 1885 in Eastwood, an expanding mining village 8 miles northwest of Nottingham. He was the 4th child and the 3rd son of Arthur John Lawrence, a butty at the nearby Brinsley Colliery, and Lydia Lawrence. Her maiden name was Beardsall, the daughter of an engine fitter who was born in Manchester and lived in Sheerness in Kent before moving with her family to Sneinton, a notoriously rough suburb of Nottingham, to live as cheaply as possible close to her father's relatives. Although accounts of Lawrence's background often refer to his father as a coal miner and his mother as middle class, the reality was far more complex. As a butty, Arthur was a skilled workman who effectively employed his own team of daymen at the pit and could earn good money, while Lydia, who had aspired at one time to be a teacher, had been reduced by a catastrophic accident suffered by her father at Sheerness in 1870 to working as a lace drawer in the Nottinghamshire lace industry. Lawrence's parents met through family connections, since Lydia's maternal uncle, John Newton, was married to Arthur's maternal aunt, Alvina Parsons. Lydia and Arthur attended a Christmas party thrown by John and Alvina at their home in New Basford, a northern suburb of Nottingham, in 1874, and experienced a deep mutual attraction to each other. They married just a year later, on the 27th of December 1875. She was 24, he was 27. They initially lived in Brinsley, a village which neighbours Eastwood, in a house which Arthur rented from his mother. But thereafter, they were forced to move where the work was, so they stayed for short periods in New Cross, in South Normanton, and in Old Radford, before settling in Eastwood in 1883, 2 years before Lawrence was born. Well, the life and culture of Eastwood at that period are in many ways profoundly alien to us. the census records the population as 4,363 in 1891. It had been just 2,540 in 1871, so it's rapidly expanding as a mining district. There were 10 pits within walking distance of the village, and 98% of people relied upon coal mining as their primary source of income. The local mining company, Barber Walker and Company, owned 6 mines in the area. It's very difficult to imagine the living conditions which resulted from the extent of the local industry. Dust in the air created a host of respiratory and pulmonary problems for residents. Tuberculosis and bronchitis caused the largest percentage of fatalities in the district, but there were also regular epidemics of measles, diphtheria, diarrhea, scarlet fever, and whooping cough. Lawrence was a delicate and a sickly baby. Problems with his lungs would haunt him throughout his life. He'd suffered, in fact, 2 near-fatal bouts of pneumonia in 1901-2 and 1910-11, and he may have fallen ill earlier than this as well. The life of Lawrence's father and his fellow workmen down the pit was very demanding. Lawrence's father recalled having started work at the pit at the age of 7. 7. Yeah, he had his first proper job underground when he was 10, so he worked above ground for 3 years in the first instance. In 1892, there were up to 288 persons employed underground at Brinsley Colliery at any one time, working from 6 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon in dark and often dangerous conditions. There was always the risk of an accident which could reduce a family to poverty by crippling or killing the principal wage earner. One of Lawrence's paternal uncles, James Lawrence, died in a mining accident at Brinsley in 1880. Any of you know the short story Odour of Chrysanthemums will know that that wonderful early short story Lawrence actually drew upon the death of his uncle very closely in that tale. Lydia Lawrence never felt herself to be part of this tight-knit community, and to a certain degree she held herself aloof from it. Although she had endured straitened circumstances with her parents and siblings from 1870, the family had actually lived beyond its means for some time while she was a young girl. The Nottingham Beardsalls on her father's side were said to have once been important landowners in the area. Her mother's family, the Newtons, could boast of having a composer in its lineage. I think it's significant that in spite of their financial plight, Lydia's 5 sisters all married respectably into the upper working or middle classes. And Lydia herself, having spent time in Kent, spoke with a Kentish intonation which must have struck her neighbours in Nottinghamshire as rather well-to-do and to some pretentious as well. One family living 3 doors away from her and Arthur during Lawrence's childhood felt that Mrs. Lawrence, having chosen to marry a collier, might have tried harder to make a collier's wife. Lydia's sense of identity then, I think, was invested very much in a determined resistance to the outlook and values of her working class neighbours. Arthur, on the other hand, was surrounded by family members in Eastwood. At the time of their move to 8A Victoria Street in 1883, his brother Walter was living just a short walk away in Princes Street. His parents, John and Louisa, his brother George, and his 2 married sisters, Emma and Sarah, were all nearby in Brinsley. So Arthur was thoroughly at home in the colliery village, and he seems to have been popular with his workmates and respected for his skills as a miner. His own line of descent is more obscure than his wife's, so that even establishing his date of birth has proved problematic. He repeated to his family a romantic story about his paternal grandfather being a refugee from the French Revolution, a Frenchman who had fought in the Battle of Waterloo and married an English barmaid. He loved dancing and was remembered in the area as an attractive character, lively and gay, with an infectious laugh and a good singing voice, and a genial old chap who loved his children. Of course, that really counteracts the account that Lawrence gives of him in Sons and Lovers. The attraction which had drawn Arthur and Lydia together gave way to disillusionment and resentment once his wife came to appreciate the realities of life as the wife of a butty. Lydia, with her proud Wesleyan Methodist upbringing and interest in religious and intellectual matters, insisted on looking above and beyond Eastwood for her fulfilment, fully intending to lift her children out of their present circumstances. She was, for instance, an active member of the Eastwood branch of the Women's Cooperative Guild, and she was known to entertain the local minister, the Reverend Robert Reed, in discussing religious and philosophical issues. She was also, importantly, a staunch teetotaler, strongly opposed to the drinking habits of the miners and what she considered to be their deleterious consequences. Lydia made sure that all of her children signed up to the Band of Hope, a Christian temperance association which urged young and old alike to renounce alcohol. Through stringent habits of domestic economy, she sought to save enough money to draw upon in times of need, and to maintain some small but significant degree of distinction for her family. Before Lawrence's birth, she'd begun to supplement the family's income by selling lace and linen from the front room of their house in Victoria Street. To be a shopkeeper or a merchant was important because these were respectable professions. So Lawrence grew up then in a family riven by profound divisions. He was caught between his father's sense of joy and belonging to the community and the dissatisfaction of his mother with her aspiring religious and intellectual values. According to his mood, Lawrence could find inspiration in the idea of both a hymn-writing relation and a revolutionary Francophile ancestry. But the home conflict between spirituality and passion, between morality and carelessness, between intellect and the non-intellectual, was also confusing and unsettling for a young mind. Accounts of uncontrollable childhood tempers and bouts of unmotivated crying suggest that he experienced a strong feeling of insecurity during his earliest years, responding to the upset of his parents before he could fully comprehend its cause. The tension of home is explored in a late poem entitled Red Herring, in which Lawrence describes himself and his siblings as in-betweens and little nondescripts, speaking received pronunciation inside the house in order to satisfy the mother, of course, and the less respectable dialect outside of it when they were among the miners and among the community. The breach between the two forms of speech was very stark and polarising, and Lawrence's awareness of it would have been formative. Although he retained an ability to speak the dialect into adulthood and an extraordinary facility to convey a version of it in his writing right to the end of his life, there was little doubt where his early allegiance lay as Lydia Lawrence's youngest son, particularly after his mother's affections transferred to him following the death of his brother Ernest from erysipelas from blood poisoning on the 11th of October 1901. He said he felt that he had to hate his father for mother's sake. His brothers, George and Ernest, had responded very differently to the challenging atmosphere of home. It was Ernest who carried forward Lydia's hopes up to the time of his death. His progress in employment had demonstrated the energy and aspiration that his mother instilled in him. He left school at the age of 14 and toiled his way up from a job at the co-op at Langley Mill, which is another adjoining village, and a position in the offices of the Shipley Colliery Company to work for John Griffith Cycle Corporation Limited in Coventry, finally securing a lucrative job as a clerk in a solicitor's office in London. So his trajectory is very much driven by the mother's ambition, and you can see that. The energy is extraordinary, really, in many respects. George's early life, meanwhile, seemed to be shaped by a dogged refusal to get on. He greatly admired his father and shared some of his spirit and recklessness. After leaving school, he worked for a brief period at High Park Colliery before becoming apprenticed to a picture framer. Shortly before his 19th birthday, during a trip to Ilkeston, a nearby town, he impulsively signed on to serve for 7 years with the King's Own Scottish Borderers. His mother was forced to buy him out of the army at great expense around 15 months later. We don't know how she did this, but since her sisters had married quite comfortably into the lower middle and middle class, it seems that she actually probably borrowed some money from one of her sisters in order to do that. In May 1897, not long after his release, George married a girl whom the family considered unsuitable. She was 3 months pregnant at the time. He then got a job as a turner, a mechanic's job, and subsequently went to live in Nottingham, where he worked for an engineering firm. Only later did he settle down and attain the respectability his mother so valued, becoming a pious, committed and hard-working lay preacher. I think it's extraordinary to dig out Lawrence's own sense of identity, his own sense of rebellion, but also his deep sense of kind of religious commitment to life from his brother's experience, the experience in the family. In discovering his own place in the world, the young Lawrence had to negotiate the paths of conformity and rebellion trodden by his brothers. Ernest had been a great success at school and a keen sportsman, so that Lawrence was told by his headmaster at Beauvale Board School, his infant school, that he was not fit to tie his brother's bootlaces. He was a very sickly child, a snotty-nosed little collier's lad, he described himself as later in life. He was withdrawn from school for 3 years shortly after he started attending the infant section in 1889 when he was 4 years old, probably on account of ill health. He was tormented by his peers because of his preference for playing with the girls. They used to shout, apparently, "Dicky, Dicky Denches plays with the wenches." This is one of the things they used to shout at him. However, in spite of his shrinking sensitivity and an instinctive aversion to new environments, which caused him to hate his early experiences at school, he was studious and gifted in his own way, achieving some considerable success in his formal education. In July 1898, he won a prestigious Nottinghamshire County Council scholarship to Nottingham High School, a grammar school, which he attended between September 1898 and July 1901. Well, that, of course, was the first step, in a way, of Lawrence's movement outside the experience of Eastwood and away from Eastwood. He later, of course, won a scholarship to Nottingham University College, where he studied to become a certified teacher. So he was very much a result of a number of the kind of legal changes which allowed working class children to be educated in the way that their middle class peers were. And he really moved outside the experience of his friends and of Eastwood through these 2 scholarships that he received. Well, okay, that's at least something of the kind of the opening, his early experiences, his earliest family experiences. And in a way, I suppose that account tries in some small way to begin to address that very difficult question of where somebody's rebelliousness comes from. Where creativity comes from is a much more difficult question. I don't think biographers ever are able to completely pin that down. But in Lawrence's case, I think you can see that his religious sense of self and also his rebellion is something that's repeated in the family, and as a result, perhaps, of this very conflictual upbringing that he experienced in Eastwood. Well, the research anecdotes that I want to share with you, I think they have this in common, that they demonstrate that for all the hard work that you do when you're writing a biography in libraries, for all the sense that you have to go through all of the letters and assimilate a lot of the other biographical writings that are already out there, the moments of real breakthrough often happen as a result of pure serendipity. They're often some things that happen by sheer chance, and that certainly is the case with the biography that I worked on. The first anecdote actually has to do with an apparently rather obscure corner of Lawrence's life, but one that's been really important in critical accounts of his writing. My PhD at the University of East Anglia, which I wrote between 1996 and 2000, was on the influence of the Italian art movement, Italian Futurism, on Lawrence. In summer 1914, Lawrence, who was actually living in a place called Fiascarino in the Golfo della Spezia in northwest Italy, he read a couple of volumes of Italian Futurist writings. These were very new at the time, and he actually tried to read them in Italian. He found them very obfuscated, very obscure, and very modern. And he wrote a couple of letters off the back of reading these, in which he redefines his idea of character. These letters are often taken as really important documents in Lawrence's switch from being a realist writer, which arguably he is to a certain degree in Sons and Lovers, to a form of experimental modernism, which is explored, of course, and expressed in The Rainbow and Women in Love. And so they've been talked about constantly, but nobody had really traced where Lawrence got these Italian Futurist volumes from, exactly what he read, and how and what ideas he took from the Italian Futurists. So that's what I did for 3 to 4 years as a PhD student. Mark Kincaid Weeks, a wonderful scholar, had attempted to discover how Lawrence got hold of those volumes in Fiascarino. And he had speculated that Lawrence had got to know a friend of the artist Umberto Boccioni, arguably one of the very greatest Italian Futurist painters, and this might have been one of the ways in which he had gained access to these volumes. And that was really, it seemed to be a dead end. That seemed as far as you were ever going to get down that line. And certainly I never went beyond it in the 4 years of my PhD research. But in September 2013, I was contacted by Eleanor Danielson, the retired director of the Hoover Library and Archives at Stanford University. I don't know how it happened, but she had heard that I was working on a biography of Lawrence, and she wrote to ask whether I'd be interested in looking at the uncut version of the memoirs of a woman called Ivy Lowe Litvinov, describing a 6-week stay that Ivy Lowe, as she then was, had had with the Lawrences in Fiascarino between May and June 1914. She at the time was a 25-year-old, well, she just published her first novel actually, very precocious 25-year-old, who'd read Sons and Lovers and absolutely adored it. She was a friend of Catherine Carswell and really wanted to go out and visit the Lawrences, and got the invitation through shared friends. The Lawrences initially thought that she would come out and stay with them for a week. She stayed for 6. This began eventually to kind of irritate Frida in particular, to have a young woman around who was so devoted to Lawrence and looked up to him in all those kinds of ways. Ivy Lowe Litvinov wrote her memoir of that 6-week stay in the 1940s, and she published it in Harper's Bazaar in 1946. The Harper's Bazaar memoir was subsequently reprinted in the Harper's Bazaar form in Edward Nells's absolutely wonderful 3-volume composite biography of D.H. Lawrence, and that's how Lawrence scholars know about it. But wonderfully, Eleanor Danielson had realised that the version that they had at Stanford University was much longer than the Harper's Bazaar version. Evidently, Harper's Bazaar had looked at it and cut it down pretty radically in order to publish it. So in the way that retired people have a little bit more time to actually pursue things they wish they'd done, I suppose, in their actual career, she went out and actively sought me out to see whether I'd have a look at it and if it was of any interest. And of course, naturally, I said it was of enormous interest. I didn't think at the time that she photocopied it for me and sent it to me that it would contain anything particularly new. But how wrong I was. When it arrived, I of course had the Edward Nell's version at the side of me, and I had the typescript here. And the early signs were not good. She wrote an enormous account of her train journey out from Britain to northwest Italy, which I must say I can see exactly why Harper's Bazaar would have cut it. However, imagine my amazement when I got to page 33 of the typescript. And Ivy, in a part that was cut by the Harper's Bazaar editors, described accompanying Lawrence and Frida on a trip they made to a Russian writer's house in a place nearby called Levante. The eccentricities of this Russian writer are described, and then Ivy turns her attention to the guests, which she must have remembered. They must have been so extraordinary, these people, that she remembered all of those years later, decades later. She wrote this: some of these guests were young girls, some little children, some old governessy-looking females, and some were young men. One of the guests was the editor of an Italian futurist paper, and 2 or 3 belonged to its staff. It's extraordinary when you're working on a biography and writing history, because, of course, so many of the big events in somebody's life never get committed to paper. The only other people who could have actually described that meeting and described who the guests were Lawrence and Frida. They didn't do it. Thank goodness that Ivy Lowe Litvinov did all of those years later. And suddenly 3 to 4 years spent actually working on this subject were illuminated with an insight which all of those years of study just didn't provide in many ways. John Worthen actually examined my PhD thesis. I was utterly terrified, of course. But when he got to read the first draft of the biography, I was absolutely delighted when I nailed exactly how Lawrence had found the Italian futurist volumes, and he wrote bravo in the margin. I like to think that that made up for the relative kind of dullness of the 300 pages that he had to read back in 2000. Well, it didn't, of course, produce that insight, a very long piece of writing in the biography. But it was, I must say, one of the more satisfying discoveries that I made. And this is an account of that futurist reading. It comes from May, so we're in May 1914. The Lawrences are living in Fiascarino. Lawrence has just finished a draft of The Rainbow, which he sent off to his mentor, Edward Garnett. And he's at a bit of a loose end. He's about to leave Italy, and he has a little bit of time to himself. Having sent the manuscript off, Lawrence felt queer, his words, and loose at the roots, in prospect of leaving our Fiascarino. He thought that he ought to write some sketches about Liguria, because that was how he lived, through these travel sketches very often. But he was not in the mood. Instead, he and Frida visited the Waterfields, an expat family that they'd got to know out there, for a few days at the end of May. It was during several very lazy days at the start of June that Lawrence read 2 books by the Italian futurists and wrote to his old teaching friend Arthur MacLeod and to Edward Garnett, reflecting on his interest in their manifestos, in their essays and their artworks. He'd come into contact with the editor of an Italian futurist magazine, plus 2 or 3 of its staff members, during a visit with Frida and Ivy Lowe to the amphitheatrophs at Levante in May. It was almost certainly they who passed on the books and encouraged him to write an essay on futurism for an English paper. The futurist brash attacks on tradition helped Lawrence to identify and defend his own ambition in The Wedding Ring, the early version of The Rainbow. Like them, he wanted the purging of the old forms and sentimentalities and to revolt against beastly sentiment and slavish adherence to tradition and the dead mind. Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, Ardengo Soffici and Paolo Buzzi could be drawn upon as allies with a similar interest in attacking the accepted moral forms of art and in breaking apart the old stable ego of the character. In its iconoclasm, Lawrence felt that his novel too was a bit futuristic, he said, quite unconsciously so. But he also insisted on his difference from the futurists, responding to their misogyny by asserting that new expression can only be achieved through a marriage of the male and female. Art, he says, must be the joint work of man and woman. So many people, I think, who do PhDs struggle to draw a line under their PhD. They manage to do it fairly quickly, I think, in the sense that when you're writing a PhD, you're so committed to a small line of argument that you necessarily remain blind to what lies outside of it. But this certainly felt like a putting to sleep of the research that I'd done, and also an illumination of it as well, but through pure chance in many respects. Well, now I'm moving on to a part of the biography that has to do with New Mexico, and particularly with Taos. I've always been really interested in figures in Lawrence's life who were really important to him, but who are almost absent from the biographical record. One such figure is a Danish artist called Kai Gertjer. During the first spell that Lawrence spent in New Mexico, in the winter of 1922 to 23, he lived at the Del Monte Ranch over a very cruel winter, actually, a very cold winter, with two Danish artists, Knud Merrold and Kai Gertjer. These were two strapping Danes, very penurious. They had almost no money at all. And Lawrence, of course, for that very reason, I think, warmed to them immediately. And he invited them to stay with him at the ranch. He covered all of their costs, whilst they contributed a lot of hard labour to getting the ranch ready for winter and for going out hunting and doing a lot of the heavy chores around the place. But Knud Merrold went on to become an artist of some note in America. Kai Gertjer didn't. Knud Merrold wrote a pretty famous memoir of Lawrence entitled A Poet and Two Painters, which is offers one of the very best accounts of Lawrence's time in New Mexico. Kai didn't produce any memoir at all. In 1923, after the period in New Mexico, Lawrence's first period there, Kai accompanied Lawrence down the west coast of Mexico and stayed with him in Mexico City, and even travelled back with him to Europe towards the end of 1923. So he spent a lot of time one-to-one with Lawrence, but never, for any particular reason, felt like committing it to paper. So here's a figure who's a kind of like the Dark Lady of Lawrence's biography, kind of unknown in many respects, but very, very significant. Well, when I first came to Nottingham in 2010, I gave a paper on Lawrence and Kai Gertjer in Eastwood. And I tried to hunt out as much information as we had on Kai. I'd actually managed to acquire a signed copy of Lawrence's novellas, The Captain's Doll, from Denmark, inscribed to Kai Gertjer from D.H. Lawrence. That was still in Denmark around about 2008. My suspicion was that the family were perhaps still there. And I tried my level best to contact them. The Brooklyn Museum and Art Gallery has in its collections some wonderful paintings by Kai Gertjer, but when I contacted them, they didn't know Gertjer's date of death. They couldn't provide any information, and they had no idea of any contact in Denmark or of Gertjer's estate. Anyway, I gave this paper showing them the paintings that I'd discovered and describing all the known contacts between Lawrence and Gertjer. I subsequently sent emails into Denmark trying my level best to find the family. I sent them, for instance, to the art school in Copenhagen that I know that Gertjer had attended. They had no lead at all either. So imagine my surprise when 2 years after I'd done that, and whilst I was working on the biography, I was contacted by a man, email this was, Stefan Lange, who was married to a granddaughter of Gertjer, and who told me that Gertjer's daughter, Hannah Roymont, was still alive. He'd actually seen an internet record of that paper that I'd delivered on Gertjer in Eastwood, and he Googled me, because he was working on a biography of Gertjer at the time and wanted to know as much as he could about the literary background to Gertjer's links with Lawrence. Sometimes, I must say, it doesn't seem to me terribly often, technology is our friend. It's not just about getting reference requests and a whole range of other things, and onerous things come through for you at any given time. It also makes the world smaller, and it facilitates connections that were unimaginable, I think, pre-1995. Stefan subsequently opened up to me his family's extraordinary archive of materials on Kai. He actually invited me out to Denmark. The family were extraordinary. They were very, very keen, of course, to talk about Kai, and they were keen to get out the scrapbooks and the photographs that they had of Kai too. Very exciting. He let me, for instance, use and ultimately publish the text of an unpublished letter and postcard from Lawrence to Kai that the family had kept. He also allowed me to reproduce in the biography an unpublished photograph of Lawrence and Kai operating a two-man saw at the Del Monte Ranch. An unposed image which vividly captures Lawrence doing something he loved, working outdoors with friends in his new cowboy boots and corduroys. This is a fascinating and very kind of, for me, quite moving and to some degree comic picture of Lawrence, because you can actually see the neck of Goethe. He was a big strapping Dane. Merrill actually had qualified in 1920 to represent Denmark at backstroke in the Olympic Games. And Goethe, by Merrill's admission, was even bigger than he was. So these were men you wanted to have in the ranch halfway up the mountain, believe me, in the middle of winter. And you can see Lawrence's build here, comparative to Goethe, very, very tiny, I would say. Lawrence, I think, loved outdoor work, and he had a very, I think, a somewhat unrealistic sense of how helpful he was at doing outdoor work. And there's a wonderful anecdote that Knud Merrill tells in A Poet and Two Painters. It's one of the really funny anecdotes in Lawrence's biography. The Danes, of course, noticed that whenever they worked together operating the two-man saw, things went very quickly, and they got through an awful lot of cutting for firewood. Whereas when they worked with Lawrence, things went considerably slower. And when they pointed this out to Lawrence, as usual with outdoor work, he wasn't willing to concede that perhaps his technique was not as good as the Danes. And so Merrill apparently said to him, "How is it that when I and Goethe work the two-man saw, things go very well, whereas when either of us operated with you, things go very badly?" And Lawrence replied, "That's because you're both doing it wrong." But that wasn't everything. This photo wasn't everything, of course, that the family showed me and that they had in their family collections. And I'm pleased to be able to share with you here just a few of the things which I had to leave out from the biography. The first thing really is what Kai looked like. Because the Danes were of a similar build, and actually in many respects look quite similar, no source had ever distinguished Kai from Knud Merrill. And for me, dealing with a man who was very close to Lawrence and in many ways very different from Knud Merrill, it seemed very important to me to actually know what he looked like in the first place. None of the available biographies of Lawrence could do that. There is a very famous photograph of Lawrence with the Danes in Los Angeles. When they first left New Mexico, went to work doing various things in Los Angeles. They actually worked on a mural in the library, painting a mural in the library of a wealthy man in California. And they'd always worked actually around the film industry, doing posters for films and various things. Lawrence went to stay with them, and there's a posed photograph of the Danes with Lawrence in Los Angeles, and with another Danish friend that they'd had up there called J. Winchell Burton. Keith Sagar, the late Keith Sagar, in one of his books on Lawrence, had very kind of confidently distinguished in the caption to this photograph Knud Merrill from Kai Goethe. So I emailed Keith and said, "Do you know for sure that that's Merrill and that's Goethe?" And he got back to me and said, "I have no idea at all." I had to caption it, and I captioned it in that way. He's, as so often with Keith, great Lawrence scholar of course, his instincts were absolutely right. How do I know this? Because when I was in Denmark, the original of that photograph is in the possession of the Goethe family. And what do you know? Every member on the photograph signed it. This is Lawrence's signature in the bottom right-hand corner. And I know Knud Merrill's signature, so I know that all the men signed it. So you can see that Goethe's at the back. You can see actually how similar the men look. Knud Merrild on the left there, and Gertrude at the back. Who would have distinguished those two without they'd signed it comparatively in the place where they were? And finally, therefore, the family opened up to me some wonderful images of Kai. Here's a fantastic example of him with the Danes Airedale, Scotty, which stayed actually with them at the Del Monte Ranch when Lawrence was there. This was taken on a trip which the Danes took from New Mexico to Los Angeles after the stay with Lawrence at the Del Monte Ranch. And the car here is the famous, actually the infamous Model T Ford, which they called Lizzie, of course after Tin Lizzie. It belonged to the Danes. Lawrence had many rides in this, and it was renowned for breaking down. He had, I must say, many very uncomfortable rides on this, I think, over dusty tracks during his time in New Mexico. But there it is, a moment where you can actually see Kai in this very intimate photograph. Well, one of the things that we know that the Danes did during their time in New Mexico is have an exhibition of the artwork that they produced when they were living with Lawrence in Taos. This exhibition they organised in spring 1923 in Santa Fe. It was one of the reasons why they couldn't travel with Lawrence down into Mexico the first time that he left New Mexico for that trip. Of course, we'd known nothing about what was in that exhibition at all. But lo and behold, somebody in 1923 took a photograph of the wall with the paintings on it. And this is the wall. You'll notice in the very middle, at the bottom, Kai Gertrude's very famous photograph of Lawrence, looking very gloomy indeed. Lawrence described this as his get rid of Mountseer face. Robert Mountseer was his American agent at the time, and he'd fallen out with Mountseer and was very irritated by Mountseer at the time. That is now at Austin, the University of Texas Austin, in their wonderful Lawrence collections. But a number of the other paintings around it, some of which, of course, you can see have Native American kind of content, and also drawings and paintings, of the ranch at Del Monte. These, who knows where they are now? They probably haven't made it. Thank goodness somebody took that photograph and it survived. One of the paintings, which I've blown up here, this is wonderful, I think. It's actually a painting of the inside of the Danes' cabin at Del Monte. There's Scotty the Airedale, which we saw earlier with Gertrude. We know roughly who these are. I think Gertrude is the figure on the right, because Gertrude was always the cook. He was the one who cooked. So I presume Merrild is the one peeling potatoes or doing something else, seated and doing those things. But Lawrence would, of course, have known this painting, and it gives us a kind of a glimpse into life at Del Monte over that winter that would otherwise have been completely lost. One of the really infamous events that happened during that winter of 1922 to 23 involved a small dog, a French Bull Terrier, I think, which Mabel Dodge Luhan gave to the Lawrences to look after. Lawrence called the dog Bibbles, and I think they doted on Bibbles. But there's one event which is almost inexplicable, where the dog, as Lawrence saw it, was disloyal to him. The dog became on heat and ran off. Lawrence, extraordinarily, kind of took massive offence at this. And so when it came back to preferred the company of the Danes and stayed at the Danes' cabin, Lawrence was absolutely furious. We think that his fury reflected some fury that he had with Frida, around Frida wanting to have access to her children. So the dog came in for it on behalf of Frida, I think. Disloyalty being a big theme, I think, in the Lawrence cabin at that time. And the Danes describe how Lawrence broke in to their cabin late at night, in the midst of thick snow, and actually kicked the dog through the snow. They were horrified, of course. And in a newspaper report which Kai, an interview which Kai gave to a Danish newspaper, he actually reported that Lawrence had great remorse for this and sat holding the dog for 2 days afterwards and was very remorseful for it. We knew that Knud Merrold had produced ink sketches of Lawrence with Bibbles, but scholars had always said that Goethe didn't feel the need to write a memoir, and so didn't also feel the need to draw Lawrence in that way. But I found this in the Goethe's family possessions. I think you can actually see, I think it is a French Bull Terrier, isn't it? It looks like a kind of almost demonic in this. But I think the ears and something of the outline of the dog do suggest a French Bull Terrier, do suggest the breed in that way. I think this is an ink sketch, actually. Of course, we don't have the original. That's long gone. Nobody knows where the original is, but somebody took a photograph of it at the time. They also took photographs of those murals that the Danes worked on in Los Angeles. The Lawrence scholar Michael Squires managed to photograph these murals before the building in question was demolished. That was fairly recently, actually. We managed to photograph, he photographed them. We managed to publish colour images of these in the Journal of D.H. Lawrence Studies before the house was destroyed. But this, of course, gives you a glimpse of the murals as they were being produced. The Danes photographed them, and there's more than one photograph of these murals in the collections. So, of course, all of this material that I had associated with Kai Goethe, the danger is always that because I grew to love the family, and you grow to see somebody who's been so obscure in Lawrence biography for so long that you're going to write pages and pages and pages about a couple of months. And John Wortham was quite right to write in the margin of my manuscript at one point, too much Dane. But still it was fun to be able to write a little bit more about that stay with the Danes over the winter of 1922-3, and this is just a little glimpse of that time that they had at Del Monte. So we're in October 1922. Lawrence is in Taos at the Mabel Dodge Lujan house, and it's beginning to grate on him a little bit, being around Mabel. By the end of October, Lawrence felt that he needed to find alternative accommodation to avoid being what he called Mabel's retainer or protégé. He'd initially been anxious to avoid the artist colony in Taos, but during a visit to the house of Walter Ufer, a painter and member of the Taos Society of Artists, he'd become acquainted with two young Danish painters whom he hoped might live alongside him and Frida on a ranch over the winter. Knud Merrold and Kai Guldbrandsen Goethe had recently travelled to Taos from New York in their temperamental old Ford Model T motorcar, affectionately named Lizzie. In New York, Goethe had been working for a decorating company, and they produced posters for a film company, plus cover designs for ceramics, vignettes and book plates. But both wanted to spend time painting for themselves, so had gone to Taos with a letter of introduction to Ufer. I should say that Ufer was married to a Dane as well, so I presume that was his inn, a woman called Mary Ufer. Merrold was 28 and Goethe 36, just 8 months younger than Lawrence. Lawrence and Frida liked them, and the feeling was mutual. It helped that they had no previous knowledge of Lawrence's writings, so were not sycophants, like Mabel or Mary Ufer, Walter's Danish wife, who very much admired his work. Lawrence appreciated their self-sufficiency and the cleanliness of the primitive adobe studio that Ufer had given them. Goethe was a keen cook, and both Danes were musical. Goethe played the violin and Merrold the flute, which was a genuine bonus, since Lawrence and Frida loved singing with them and staging impromptu concerts. You see a little bit of the father there, with his love of dancing and his love of singing, of course. Merrold was also a first-rate designer. Lawrence immediately saw him as a potential producer of dust jacket illustrations. He'd hated the new edition of Thomas Seltzer's new American edition of Women in Love and the design on the front cover of that. The Danes were strong and well built, perfectly suited for doing physically demanding outdoor work. On the 31st of October, they joined the Lawrences to look at a ranch 17 miles away on Lobo Mountain. Mabel owned the ranch, but had given it to her son John. The group camped out nearby. Lawrence thought it splendid and made plans to take it over. He offered to rent it from Mabel, and he invited Bessie Freeman, a friend of his, and Robert Mountsio's American agent, to join them in establishing a central farm, he said, or homestead there. Lawrence's intention to occupy Mabel's property and establish an alternative community naturally irritated his hostess. An angry exchange of letters ensued in which Lawrence set out in stark terms his hatred of what he saw as Mabel's bullying. In the end, however, the move to Lobo Mountain fell through, mainly due to the state of the property and the lack of time to renovate it for the winter. For a while, Lawrence turned his attention to other things. But around the 20th of November, he accepted an offer from Mabel's neighbours, the Hawke family, to move to their Del Monte ranch. There were 2 log cabins half a kilometre apart, one with 5 rooms, the other with 3, which would be perfect for the Lawrences and the Danes. Both were habitable, and the location was perfect, as Lawrence said, in the last foothills of the Rocky Mountains, forest and snow mountains behind, and below the desert, with other mountains very far off west. Lawrence offered to pay the rent on both cabins through to the spring, since Merrill and Gertrude were penniless. The Lawrences moved up there on the 1st of December, parting from Mabel on good terms. She retreated to Santa Fe for a while to avoid seeing them leave, but she gave them a puppy to take with them to their new home, a French Bull Terrier, which Lawrence variously called Bibbles, Bimsy, Bambino and Bubastis. Frida, the poor thing must have been terribly confused, really. Frida called it Pips or Pipsy. It was another world on the ranch. The place was remarkably isolated. It was a 5-minute walk to the Hawkes' house, but the nearest neighbours after that were 4 kilometres away in the other direction. In the other direction, there was no house for over 300 kilometres. In early December, an Indian dropped by on his way to go bear hunting in the mountains behind them. And there were mountain lions nearby too. They had to struggle, they said, with pack rats and pigs and cats, and coyotes howled by the gate at night. As winter began to bite and the snow fell, the nighttime temperature, Lawrence reported, dropped to minus 25 degrees centigrade. It was necessary for him to melt ice in order to have water. However, despite the strangeness and the hardships, Lawrence and Frida got on very well with the Danes. Lawrence joined them in chopping down a massive balsam pine and cutting it up for firewood using a 2-man saw. He'd bought himself new cowboy boots, a cowboy hat, a sheepskin coat and corduroy riding breeches. Frida knitted woolen hats for Gertrude and Merrill and made them curtains, bed sheets and pillows. They rode out as a group on the horses which they had borrowed from William Hawke, the recently married son of their landlords, regularly visiting the Manby hot springs, which were essential for washing, and they ate and sang together. I think I've gone on for a very kind of long time. There are plenty of other things that I could say about the biography, but I don't want to keep us all here for too long. I think those are 2 of the more interesting findings and some glimpse of how they found their way into the biography. So thank you very much.